Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal's SSCP Certification Video Training Course, and in this lesson I'm going to talk about malicious activity countermeasures, all the ways you can protect yourself from all those clever attacks that I've been talking about in the other lessons. First and foremost, lots of training. Nowadays, so many attacks can't be prevented with firewalls and anti-malware and software because they exploit our weaknesses as human beings. So you just need to train your people. Spend lots and lots of time training them and refresh it on a regular basis. Now, I've covered this in way more depth in other lessons, so I won't go into a lot of detail here. But be sure to teach them how to avoid phishing and malware and shoulder surfing, piggybacking, impersonation, social network attacks. Tell them over and over again, if you see something, say something. And maybe even have a reward system in place so they get paid, because some people, maybe they'd rather not what they call rat or tattle. So you have to kind of motivate people to say something, even though they're protecting their organization. Your IT people need really special training, because they're the ones managing these systems, which now are so often the focus of these attacks. Your systems administrators and systems engineers and architects, get them SSCP and CISSP certified. As you can tell, this whole process of certification requires you to learn about and respect security. For your developers, you need them to learn secure coding best practices. They can also get that by pursuing a certification in their development environment of choice. Be sure you have security policies. You need everybody at your organization, employees and contractors alike, to sign an internet network and computer usage policy. This basically tells them you can use your computer for work, you can use the network for work, you can use the internet for work, but don't do anything personal. This requires your employees to agree to use your computers and network and internet connection for work stuff, but maybe not even personal things. Sometimes you'll allow personal things, but you'll always prevent them from doing illegal things, malicious things, or unethical things. You need to be really clear about what people are and aren't allowed to do. This makes them aware of what they should and shouldn't be doing, and lets them know that there are specific consequences for their actions. And you need to make it clear that not only will they be reprimanded and fired, but that you will take legal action. People need to be a little bit afraid of doing things. Now, most employees would never do it anyway, but every now and then you get that employee in there who has that little evil spark in his eye. You generally don't write these from scratch. Instead, I'd recommend starting with a template that's available freely online. Make sure you involve your legal department and have them review everything. Your HR department should be involved too. I've said this in other lessons, but just be nice. Treat your people fairly. Be honest with your employees. Don't lie to them about maybe upcoming layoffs or why they're getting laid off. Give severance whenever you can. If your company does well, hand out bonuses. This doesn't sound security related, but in a way it is, because so many attacks today come from disgruntled employees. So one of the ways you can prevent those attacks is by not disgruntling your staff. Honeypots are also a useful way to find people even inside your organization who might be doing something malicious. Setting up a honeypot can be as simple as setting up a shared folder with confidential files in it, but they're really just fake files. And you'll just set up auditing on those files, and if anybody ever tries to open those files, well, they're doing something at least a little naughty, right? There's nothing legit there, and there's no legitimate reason anybody would ever stumble across it. So just be careful about entrapping people. Don't be too alluring with it. If you create a folder that says everybody's salary and bonus plans for the next year, you're going to entrap some people into looking at that when they wouldn't normally do it. However, if you create a rather boring and innocuous folder that is clearly labeled confidential and employees miss these obvious cues and go on to look at it, well, that's not necessarily cause for legal action, but it does identify an employee that you might want to keep an eye on. Up next, require collusion. This is basically requiring 2 or more people to work together to do anything particularly important or privileged in your organization. One example of this would be accessing your public key infrastructure's root certificate, because somebody with access to the private key as part of the root certificate would be able to issue certificates for your organization and impersonate your organization in a very secure way. So you generally keep that under literal physical lock and key and offline, but you don't even want one person to have the key. You want to have two locks in there. One way to do that is to have it protected with a password or PIN and tell two different people half the password. So you make user 1 type the first half of the password and user 2 type the second half of the password. If in the future you need to get into the system, you just pull user 1 and 2 together and get them to type the complete password. That requires them to agree that it's a good time to open it up. So if user 1 goes rogue and he wants to seal that certificate, or God forbid he gets kidnapped and somebody's using a weapon to force him to do something he doesn't want to do, well, he won't even have the option of getting into it without getting user 2 involved as well. This collusion doesn't prevent malicious acts, but it makes it much scarier and much riskier on the part of the criminal. If two people need to work together to pull something off, well, criminals don't tend to trust each other. One of them is also more than likely going to blab to somebody and reveal the plan. One person can keep a secret. Two people I find not so great at keeping secrets, and many criminal rings are busted simply because there are more than one people involved. Another example of this, which I don't even know if it's real or not, but it's certainly common in the media, is the idea that to launch a nuclear attack, you have to have two people turn keys in separate parts of the room simultaneously. I think I saw that in war games in like the 80s, so I don't know if that's real, but that's a good example of requiring collusion. You also need to require code review for any applications written in your organization. Require programmers to look over each other's applications. Not only does this make programmers a little more careful and a little more meticulous, as anybody would be if you knew an inspection was inevitably coming, but it also makes it a little scarier for them if they're going to do something like intentionally create a backdoor. I often think about the movie Jurassic Park, and there's that really disgusting programmer who's like surrounded by Mountain Dew cans. Thanks for portraying programmers in such a flattering way, by the way, Jurassic Park. But this particular programmer was working alone, and he did create some awful backdoors that allowed him to exploit the network that he had basically built for his own personal profit. Now, of course, he was eaten by a velociraptor or a Tyrannosaurus Rex or something, but your organization probably doesn't have dinosaurs protecting it. So instead, you'll need to just throw another programmer in there and have them look over the other programmer's code. I also recommend using cloud services. You know, I have worked with a lot of organizations who took pride in their security, and as a consequence, they tend to get really good at it. Their reputation also depends on it. So I feel like the more reputable cloud services also have really good security, robust monitoring, dedicated people working 24 hours a day, and the larger services also have geographic distribution. That means that your cloud services can be running in the US for best performance, or they can be hosted in Asia as a backup only in case the US systems are brought offline by a natural disaster or a distributed denial of service attack. Up next, I recommend regular auditing because we all make mistakes. You know, plans aren't always executed perfectly. Auditing is the process of just fixing any flaws in execution. Audits are best performed by an outside objective organization because you don't want somebody who has a vested interest in the audit turning up nothing. If you ask a manager to audit his own employees' work, he's probably going to come back and say, oh, they did a great job. If you ask an outside party to audit their work, they'll probably come back to you with a long list of things that could be improved. You want to know those things that can be improved, and you don't need to necessarily use it to embarrass somebody, but you do need an objective opinion that you can trust, and you need somebody who's not going to hold back at all. Finally, I'd like to introduce two brand new concepts that I haven't talked about in other lessons. And these are not concepts that I am necessarily endorsing, but I do see them frequently used in the security community, so I want you to be familiar with them. The first of these two is fear, uncertainty, doubt, which I usually call FUD. With FUD, you kind of let your security systems be known, but you're not too specific. So you say things to employees like, we can see absolutely everything you do on the network. Every time you go to Reddit, it pops up and I know what you're doing. Anytime you ping a system, I know about it. We all know that realistically monitoring systems aren't that perfect, but a lot of organizations, and in fact a lot of law enforcement, kind of puts it out there like they are omniscient and they can see every little thing that you do and they will track you down and they will get you. It's almost always not the truth. One example that I often see when I'm driving is a sign that says speed enforced by aircraft. And what they're saying is that they have helicopters or airplane that are like making sure I don't drive over the speed limit. Now, I don't believe that many law enforcement organizations can afford to put a helicopter or an airplane up there just to make sure I don't drive 66 in a 55 zone, but they are leveraging fear, uncertainty, doubt. They're not necessarily trying to ticket people with airplanes and helicopters. That would be unreasonably expensive. They do kind of want to put that fear in you though, because if you're speeding and you're hoping to avoid a cop on the side of the road, you might use a radar detector or you might just try to slam on your brakes. But if you think he might be in a helicopter, out of view, behind you, above you, well, he could be anywhere all the time. That's fear, uncertainty, doubt. He's probably not actually there, but that fear might make you comply. And many organizations will use this technique to try to make their employees comply with security policies. Another aspect of this is making an example of people that you catch. In other lessons, I've given examples of people who performed denial of service attacks and then were caught and brought to justice. But the sad truth of it is that thousands of denial of service attacks are performed every day, and the vast majority of the people performing them aren't caught. What law enforcement does, and it's a form of FUD, is they'll catch the one guy out of tens or hundreds of thousands of people who've committed a denial of service attack or other type of attack, and then they publicize it everywhere. And people who are thinking about doing a DOS attack, they begin to think otherwise. They'll be like, oh, they caught that guy and I don't know him, but I don't want to do that same thing because he went to jail for a long time. As a criminal, you begin to get the impression that your chances of being caught are actually much higher than they are. And it sounds a little deceptive. It's not completely honest. If the law enforcement agency were to publish honest statistics about the number of computer criminals that are caught, computer criminals would probably think, I'm almost certainly going to get away with this and I can probably make a profit. They don't talk about all the ones they don't catch, but they do talk a lot about those that they do catch. So if you just looked at what law enforcement said and if you just looked at the media, you'd probably think, we catch most of these people doing denial of service attacks. So in the end, I think that's actually accomplishing something good. Apple kind of did this vague thing. For a while there, they were trying to prevent people from jailbreaking their iPhones. And when you jailbreak it, it means you can install your own custom software. You might be able to completely bypass the Apple Store and put your own applications on there. And they didn't want people to do that. So they put out this news that if you jailbroke your cell phone, it could actually bring down the cell phone towers. They hope to rally everybody to prevent this kind of jailbreaking and make it illegal. It wasn't necessarily true. It's debatable. I'm going to classify it as fear, uncertainty, doubt. Santa Claus is also a FUD technique. You know, we do this to their kids, and I hope there are no little kids listening to this. I know this would probably be a lot of fun for a 6-year-old, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that none of us here actually believe in Santa Claus anymore. Well, my kid still does, and it, in some ways, depending on how you use it, can be a form of fear, uncertainty, doubt, because the kid thinks that Santa Claus is watching them when they're naughty and they're nice. They're watching them all the time. And that puts a little fear in the kid's head, like maybe I don't want to do something naughty or I won't get any presents. Realistically, this technique only works like 2 weeks before Christmas anyway, so. The next common technique that I want to talk about, but not necessarily recommend, is a technique called security through obscurity. The philosophy behind this is that if the security vulnerabilities in your organization aren't known and aren't visible, then attackers won't find them. It's not real security though, and I have a couple of quotes here to kind of talk against using security through obscurity. And the first is Kirchhoff's principle, which is, and I'm paraphrasing this, but a system should be secure even if the enemy knows everything about the system. The next is a quote from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. System security should not depend on the secrecy of the implementation or its components. So while you shouldn't rely on security by obscurity, it is nonetheless often effective, and many people do continue to use it. Here are some practical examples. A common one that I used to see all the time is just changing the port numbers. Back in the day, worms used to attack web servers all the time because web servers were on the internet and listening for connections, and web server software like Microsoft's IIS, Internet Information Server, often had vulnerabilities that could be used to execute code. So the code red worm, for example, would scan the internet for web servers running IIS, and then it would leverage a vulnerability in IIS to install some software. One of the ways around code red was to change your default port number from port 80 to port 81 or port 8080 or anything other than 80, because all code red did was check port 80. So by moving your port number, you weren't actually patching the vulnerability or securing anything. You were simply hiding it from code red's very minimal searching. Now, all somebody had to do was create a worm that scanned other port numbers, maybe even just common numbers like 8080 and 81, and they would work around your security. But nonetheless, and I admit to this, I used it to keep some servers online during the code red attacks in the 90s. Another example of security through obscurity is closed source software. So there's always this debate between open source software like Linux and closed source software like Windows. And many people say that open source software is inherently more secure because anybody can go in and look at the source code and make sure that everything is done with secure coding best practices. They say that closed source software might be secure or it might not, because you can't look at the code, you don't know. Well, companies like Microsoft don't like to reveal their source code, not just because they would be giving up intellectual property, but also because if you were to inspect the code, it would make it much easier to find vulnerabilities. So protecting the existence of vulnerabilities by hiding your source code is an example of security through obscurity. A lot of people do this at their house. They will hide a spare key under a rock. and obviously, if the spare key were in the doorknob, you'd have no security. Every attacker who came to the door would say, oh, there's a key there, I can just unlock this. So you move it over to a rock, but you don't protect the rock. Anybody can pick the rock up and get the key. It's an example of security through obscurity because the house is basically open. The only thing preventing somebody from coming in is the fact that they don't know that the key is located under a rock. Guess what? Robbers know that you hide keys under rocks, and they know that you put them over the door sill, or you put them in a bird feeder or a flower basket. They know all those places, underneath the doormat. So they will look there, and don't do that anymore. Another similar example is that if people need to leave their keys in their car for something, they'll hide it in the visor over the driver's window, and that's convenient. But everybody knows about it. So if you see a car unlocked and you wanted to rob it, just flip that visor down. There might not be keys there, but sometimes there will be. These are examples of security through obscurity, and they don't hold up because when too many people do them, then they're not obscure anymore. Criminals know about them, but the people doing them still might think they're secure enough, but they're not. Finally, fake security cameras are common too, or those little signs that people put outside their house that say, this house protected by Secure Co technology, and it's just a sign or it's just a fake security camera. It's not wired into anything. Nowadays, criminals are sophisticated enough that they can look at it and know that it's not a legit company or it's not a legit camera. And they know that you are a potential target because you wouldn't have that out there if you actually had a good security system. I will say that it will scare away some really casual and unsophisticated criminals, but it's not going to work on the more sophisticated attackers. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.